getting it right early matters. Make sure what you're working on is something you love. If you don't love it, it's hard to create a culture of people around you that somehow do. What are the unwritten rules of behavior? Those first 20 people are kind of the DNA of your culture. Articulate the vision in a way that will make other people feel it as well.
Welcome to the Nestor Leadership Podcast. I'm Bogdan, and it's such a pleasure to have Tim Brady on the show today to talk about how can a strong company culture be your startup safety belt in times of crisis. Tim is a partner at Y Combinator, co-founder of Imagine K12, and the former chief product officer at Yahoo. So thanks so much for joining us today, Tim.
Sure, it's my pleasure.
Working so closely with so many startups at YC, we'd love to find out, in your opinion, when is the right time for a startup founder to start building a company culture? And in general, what does a company culture really mean?
Sure. I mean, culture has such a broad definition. What I like to do when talking about it with regards to startups is try to narrow that definition a little bit. And the most important thing a startup can do is, two things with regard to culture. One, make sure what you're working on is something you love, right? If you don't love it, it's hard to create a culture of people around you that somehow do. It's near impossible. So make sure what you're doing is something you're passionate about and truly feel. And that is probably one of the most important elements of creating a strong culture. And I'll get into kind of the definition of what that means. I think the other thing you need to do as a startup founder is to articulate. So not only do you have to feel it, but you have to articulate the vision in a way that will make other people feel it as well, right? Make sure it's concise and clear, because when you're creating a company, it's way harder to bring a bunch of people around you and then get them and try to create a culture from that, rather than attracting the right type of people who are already excited about what you're doing. It's much easier to build a culture with those people who are there primarily for the right reasons than to take kind of people that don't necessarily have a connection with the vision and then try to build a culture on top of that. So getting that kind of foundation right is critical, is probably the essential critical thing for creating a strong culture. And so to get to the kind of my definition of culture, at least with startup culture, right? Again, culture is a pretty broadly defined term, but when I think of startup culture, what I think of is like, what are the unwritten rules of behavior, right? So good management will lay out, okay, this is Bogdan, this is what I expect of you. Here are here's how I will measure you. And those things are all laid out for you on how to behave. But that's only a part of what you do. Like, there's a whole bunch of time and things that you do where you're behaving in a way that aren't laid out for you. And so how do you know how to behave in that part of your day? And I would argue that culture is that thing that helps you know how to behave correctly. Here's a really simple thing, right? It's like, do you show up for meetings on time, right? Is it a culture of punctuality or not? And like, your boss isn't necessarily going to make that one of your kind of key results, but if if everyone's on time, you don't keep showing up late, right? You show up with everyone else. So that's just kind of one small example of 100 little things that matter, kind of define what a culture is inside of a company.
So from your perspective, if we were to narrow down to just a few first steps, what would those be for a startup founder in starting defining a culture when it's just the founders and maybe one or two employees?
Yeah, so in addition to making sure the vision is clearly communicated, the other thing you can do as just the co-founders is begin to think and come up with a list of values that are important to you. that aren't necessarily related to your vision, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's, honesty, integrity. There's a bunch of kind of basic values, and you can't have them all, right? You can try to have them all, but like you want a short list of the most important ones to you
Mm-hmm.
when you think about what type of company you want to build. So come up with that short list, right? And agree upon it, and then begin to think about how do we create questions, interview questions to filter out people that don't have these values,
Mm-hmm.
right? So a really critical thing is to hire the right people early on, because what happens, the culture or a good percentage of the culture is set very early on. And um, startups usually go through, several kind of typical phases. One's kind of the ideation phase when it's just you and the co-founders, and then you hire a couple of people and you search for product market fit, and then when you find product market fit, you scale.
Mm-hmm.
So before you scale, you need to have a very firm foundation of corporate culture, right? Those, the way I like to say it, those first 20 people or 10 people or however many it is, are kind of the DNA of your culture. And if you don't get that right, it's just like your DNA. It's nearly impossible to change it later on. And so getting it right early matters. And so that's why there's a lot of thinking and planning that needs to go on early, to communicate, define what those values are, and then find the right first set of people to bring them in, right? Because those people, those first 20, are going to be involved in hiring the next 100. So if you get those people, it's random, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you got to get those people right. And when they're involved in the process, in the hiring process, there's a much higher likelihood that they're going to be better at bringing in the right type of people to bring in kind of this unified culture, that'll support your company.
So basically, setting a strong foundation for your culture actually helps you when you pass the initial stages and go into scaling up. So you're kind of setting up your DNA for the next steps.
Yeah, I would even go further than that. It's once you're at you can't, when you're at 200 people, you can't say, okay, we're going to create a culture of X, because by that time it's largely defined, right?
Mm-hmm.
You probably didn't get a chance to define it, but it's defined, like behaviors, how people think. Um, there are some things you can do to make it better, but to change it, certainly, 180 degrees is nearly impossible once you're at scale.
So
So getting it right is key.
So once you're scaling, how do you keep this culture that you've built? Because sometimes we see startups in high growth that are going from, I don't know, 20 people to 100 people in a very, very short time. So
Right.
I can imagine that this is very challenging. So how do you keep enforcing the culture, or not necessarily enforcing, but advising the culture to the rest of the company who comes in?
Yeah, there's two. One I've already mentioned, which is this: once you have written down your corporate values, think about interview questions that will help filter out people that don't hold those values, or make sure that they elicit the right response to bring those people in. Um, so that's one. That's the first one. Second is to, when you're growing fast, you have to constantly evaluate how you're doing, right? So, every month you and your co-founder should get together and talk about who you've brought in the company, and whether you think it's going well. Um, so that's critical. You can't wait and look, you're going to have a million things on your plate when you're growing fast, but you do need to do that. It doesn't have to necessarily be this long formal thing. It can be a casual conversation every Friday evening, right, for an hour or two, and make sure you go through that list of people. And you can do two things with that. One, reevaluate how you're interviewing and how you're sourcing people, because maybe the way you're bringing them in is wrong in some way. You have the wrong recruiter, or you're looking in the wrong places, uh, or you're asking the wrong interviewing questions, or they're not strict enough in terms of how they're filtering out people. And then the third and final thing, which is by far the hardest, but also the most important, is you need to get comfortable with firing people that don't fit, right? And both for performance and or culture. Because again, early on, mistakes you made get amplified in high scaling situations. So it's really critical, those first 100 people that you stay on it, because again, it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle once you have a lot of people that don't fit or aren't good kind of in your company involved in the hiring process.
Talking about the current situation, how could a strong company culture help when transitioning to working fully remote? And how should startup leaders lead during these difficult times that we are passing now?
Great questions. I'm not sure I have great answers necessarily. A strong culture will make the transition to remote work easier, right? Again, it's these unspoken behaviors, and the trust you build amongst your coworkers that will allow you to make that change as easily as possible.
What changes in a culture, or should anything change when transitioning to working remote? And how does a company that works fully remote compare with one that works in the office in terms of culture?
Yeah, and I think that question's maybe a little bit different than a company that's forced to make that transition,
Yeah,
right?
definitely.
It's easier to create a culture in person, like in a person-to-person environment, just because there are a lot of nonverbal cues that people pick up on that are important to behavior that you don't get on Zoom like this, right? So if you're in a remote culture, that doesn't mean it can't be strong and supportive, just like the in-person culture, but it will require more time, and you'll need to be a lot more deliberate about it than if you were managing in what it would, when I say they, I mean managers. And so I think that's going to require just a lot more face-to-face time on Zoom or what have you, Hangouts, to check in with people, see how they're doing, get feedback, and just you're going to have to make sure communication is happening. Because in a in-person environment like that, communication's happening all the time. You don't necessarily need to enforce that, but like in a remote setting, it's very easy just to turn off your computer and you're not talking to anybody. So you need to make sure that communication's happening, and that's probably the most important thing.
So you have to be intentional to setting up a culture at any level of your startup to transforming to a full business.
Absolutely, and it just takes more time as in a remote setting, right? You have to be intentional in both circumstances, but a lot of it just requires more time for you as a manager, both to think about it and to communicate and to check up on how things are going.
So we were talking earlier about passing these difficult times and making hard decisions to fire people. So can a company culture actually help you as a founder and help the executive team in making these decisions easier?
It's not necessarily going to change the decision you make in terms of what's right for your company. I think a strong culture, almost every strong culture has a pretty high degree of trust. And so they will tend to trust their leaders longer than companies that don't have a strong culture. And so if you need to make a change of some sort, the trust of the leader will help, right? That established trust will help in this circumstance. It really doesn't have a ton of implications for kind of new strategic directions in this environment. I think that's kind of a separate thing. But I think in terms of when you're forced into rocky circumstances, new circumstances, again, the level of trust is much higher in strong cultures, and it allows everyone to continue working well and efficiently rather than spending a lot of time doing non-productive things, which bad cultures can happen, right? Like when people start worrying about things and gossip starts and they're not sure how to behave, that takes a lot of energy, right? And it takes more energy for someone to manage. So, the strength of communication and trust that is already part of a strong culture will tend in these kind of environments just kind of make it easier for everyone involved and have everyone kind of remain on task and the company headed in the right direction.
Thank you. So one last question, and it's a broader question. In your perspective, what could be the long-term effects of this COVID crisis on the startup and investment world, and how and if this accelerates the future of work?
I think entrepreneurship and starting companies, the way I think about starting companies, you're going to solve a problem. And it would seem to me that, the circumstances we're faced with right now have a lot of problems, right? So those problems aren't going away, which says to me like, okay, like we still need startups to help solve those problems. We can't rely on big companies to necessarily act fast. In fact, an environment like this that requires fast action, like startups are better suited to kind of move more quickly. So, what's the environment like? It's probably going to become more dynamic, not less. And I separate that from kind of the funding question. My suspicion is we will go through anywhere from a 6 to 12 or 18-month period where there'll be a lot of indecision because it won't be clear where the world's headed. And so, investors will be hesitant to place big bets without more clarity. But I think that's a temporary thing, right? I think we will get clarity, certainly when we get to a point where there's a vaccine. The world will have changed by then, and I think the needs of the world will have changed even with a vaccine. Mm-hmm. And so the types of startups may change, but the number and the activity will be the same, if not greater.
Awesome insights, Tim. Thanks so much for joining the show today and for sharing from your experience with us. It was great having you on the show, and we're looking forward to having you again in the future. So thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, Bogdan. Good to talk to you.